Oh, hi everyone. How are we doing? So, basically, I wanted to talk about what it means to be a conservative. Now, I want to give you guys a little bit of background. I grew up watching the BBC, Question Time and Newsnight, which tend to be on the left of politics. So that's really where I learnt about politics when I was sort of younger. But I never really learnt much about conservatism or what it means to be a conservative. Now, a quick note. The term left and right first appeared during the French Revolution of 1789, when members of the National Assembly were split into supporters of the king on the right and supporters of the revolution on the left. So the term's really quite old, and the meanings have changed over time, and the particular policies which left-wingers and right-wingers may support have also changed. I do also want to say that there is a real attempt to demonise right-wingers as being some kind of bad people. Quite often they'll associate the term with, for example, unpleasant people. Let's say, I don't know, terrorism. They might say they were far-right terrorists or something. But really, probably about half the population, if not more, are right-wing. And you've also got the strange situation where people who would have been traditionally more right-wing have now sort of shifted to the left, and they've kind of had a big influence on how the left kind of conceptualizes the world as well. So all of this is quite complicated. I'm going to try to keep it simple, and I do apologize if I make any generalizations, but I think it's difficult not to in a video like this. Okay. So, what is right-wing and what is conservatism? Now I'm going to use the two synonymously, so you may want to sort of do a bit of nuance by yourself to sort of work everything out. But essentially, conservatism is a belief that it is hard to create something new, and therefore we need to protect what we have created previously. So, for example, people who are more right-wing tend to value traditional values, and they may not necessarily subscribe to all traditional values, but they will look at what works and they'll basically keep it. They might throw out the bits that don't work so much, but it is very much looking at what you've got, what's working, what isn't working, instead of sort of saying we need to get rid of everything, have a huge revolution and change everything. Conservatives generally believe in incrementalism. In other words, they believe in slowly changing things over time instead of really rapid change, and they kind of perhaps are a bit more cautious about stuff like social change. So they might, for example, slowly introduce legislation instead of all at once. So a big difference between the left and the right is left-wingers generally believe in group rights. So, for example, they'll look at the rights of a particular community as they conceive it, and whereas right-wingers very much believe in individual rights. Now, some people, when they hear individual rights, think that that might be a bit selfish, but actually the opposite is true, because they believe that every single person, every single individual should be protected from tyranny, for example, and perhaps the tyranny of the mob. So group rights are very much a good thing. These might include property rights, for example. Left-wingers usually see communities as being abstract concepts, such as, traditionally, workers, or the proles, and the elites, who they would term the bourgeoisie. And, of course, they might be very interested in kind of helping the workers. Perhaps they might want the workers to rise up and to throw off the oppressive bourgeoisie and implement some kind of socialist utopia, perhaps. I mean, this kind of thinking has kind of gone out of fashion a little bit, but there are still some traditional socialists out there who believe in that sort of thing. So, more recently, the left has become very, very, very enamoured with the idea of idPol, or identity politics. Now, this basically categorises people as groups such as LGBTQIA+, women versus men, racial groups, as opposed to ethnic groups, and they kind of view a lot of these groups as being in conflict. So, for example, they might view LGBTQIA+ people being in conflict with straight people, for example, or they might believe in conflict between different racial groups. So they might look at different outcomes in different groups, and they might say, well, we need to give so much money to this group, or redistribute money, for example, from, the rich to the poor, or something like this. Right-wingers have a very different conception of community. They won't necessarily see LGBTQIA, but they might see their local community, their school, their local GP, for example. They might, talk to their neighbours. So they'll sort of see community as being geographic, as opposed to based on characteristics. Right-wing people tend to be very family-orientated, caring deeply about their immediate and extended family and the local community, and even nation states. They're more likely to kind of view communities as being based on where someone lives and sort of who they interact with on a daily basis. Okay. There's a big difference between openness. So, left-wingers are very open to new ideas and cultures. They generally want to break down borders and boundaries. They kind of want to explore a lot of different ideas, a lot of different cultures. The classic example here is Justin Trudeau. You see him sort of going to India and he's sort of dressing in traditional Indian dress, or I don't know, he might go to other countries and kind of adopt, or some might say appropriate their culture. But yeah, left-wingers are very open to different ideas and different types of people. They're obsessed with anything that's new, basically, to the point that they might become oikophobic. Oikophobia is the fear of the home, but the term also refers to a dislike of the familiar. So some people who are on the far left might hate the culture that they come from, or they might kind of view it as being in some way inferior or bad, and they might prefer other cultures. Now, this doesn't necessarily apply to that many people, but there's definitely a sort of streak of oikophobia. If you look at the Labour Party conference, they recently described white men as being stale, pale males. You might say, well, that's deeply racist. Yes, it is. But they dislike anything which seems ordinary or of the home. So, of course, they're going to attack stale, pale males in this regard, because they are kind of viewed as ordinary, I guess. Right-wingers much prefer what's already known and explored. They tend to really like their own culture, their own traditions. For example, they might be quite passionate about different festivals. For example, Christmas. They're very concerned about community and the nation state, and there's a lot to be said for this, because they'll tend to be very loyal people too. For example, if they've worked at a company for a long time, they'll probably prefer to do this as opposed to sort of moving to a different company every year, simply because they'll really like the people they work with. And they'll sort of have a bit more loyalty, I suppose. Not that I'm saying left-wing people are disloyal, it's just they have less regard for the ordinary, and they always want to move on. Let's look at equality. because left-wingers view society as competing abstract groups, they are concerned with equality and outcomes a lot more between these groups. So, like I said, they might look at the gender pay gap, for example, or racial pay gaps, or any kind of gap, and they might gaps between nations, and they'll be very, very much in favour of closing these gaps where possible. Traditionally, they were very concerned with the gap between the working class and the management class, and of course they wanted to get more money for the working class, generally speaking, although some people have observed actually left-wing people just hate the rich. So I'll let you be the judge of that. And the left tend to want most or all resources given to the government, whom they term the workers. You often hear left-wing people saying, we need to give the workers more money, for example. But what they actually mean is we need to give more money to the government, who can then distribute it to the workers. Well, that's kind of a theory, but most governments actually end up giving money to whoever will give them the most votes. So, for example, in France, often it's the farmers who will give the government the most votes. So the EU also gives farmers a lot of money. So it kind of acts as a sort of incentive, or you might say a bribe. Now, a quick note on colorblindness. So, Enlightenment values basically say that you shouldn't judge people by arbitrary characteristics such as race, perhaps religion, you could argue, disability, or any kind of difference. Broadly speaking, that's the sort of liberal conception, I should say, the conservative liberal conception. So because right-wingers generally prefer looking at nation-states and community groups, they've adopted what the left-wing term colorblindness, which basically seeks to prioritize your relationship to the community. So, for example, you could say, I'm an American, or I'm a Texan, and this is more important than your physical characteristics such as your skin tone or race. These characteristics include race, sex, gender, ethnicity, orientation, wealth, etc. The idea is people with these characteristics can become, for example, American, and they can become part of a community, or, as the left would term it, whiteness. So they view people who become, for example, part of the American establishment as being capital letter white, and they view this as being really bad because they view people who aren't part of the white elite as being somehow less. In the UK, we had almost abolished race as a concept. Instead, we've gone with ethnicity, which looks at people in terms of categories such as Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Chinese, and these had replaced the 5 or 6 racial groups. It's estimated that there are 650 ethnic groups in the world, which is a much broader and much more nuanced category than the 5 or 6 racial groups which the American left love. So, due to the influence of the left-wing American academics, we've now got race back as a category. Not only that, the American intersectional left seek to bring back and strengthen race and racial identities as characteristics. So, for example, the far left are promoting racialization and division between groups. Some of them even go so far as promoting resegregation, arguing that the whiteness of society is corrupting, I don't know, the blackness of people, blackness being the sort of poor black American communities. So they kind of view whiteness as being basically the establishment culture and blackness as being the oppressed culture. Of course, the black culture is oppressed by the white culture. And I don't know, they've gone completely mad. They say that certain black people, like Larry Elder, are the blackface of white supremacy. White supremacy no longer means anything to do with what we might term, I don't know, the Nazis or anything like that. It's now just the dominant American culture, whom they hate, because of course they hate their communities, or they hate the American community, I should say. So conservatives largely reject this whole thing, and instead they want to unite people under the banner of nationality. So, for example, they might say things like, we're all American, we're all British, we can all be a unified people who all sort of share in the common good of the country. And conservatives very much push the idea that we are all one nation, and that everyone within the nation can kind of get involved, and we can all be equals within the nation. And it's very much a sort of unifying force. There were so many people of all different ethnic backgrounds who supported Donald Trump, for example, but the left view obviously Donald Trump as being perhaps the epitome of whiteness, you know, this sort of rich, successful New York businessman. They kind of view him as being evil, perhaps. Certainly he isn't part of the force to create a sort of what they might term a diverse America. Conservatives want unity, and the left want division, essentially. So, okay, let's look at charity versus big government. Right-wingers generally want smaller government and lower taxes, which would mean charity would take a far greater role. And left-wingers basically want massive governments, and they want redistribution of wealth. The basic theory of trade and economics is when you set people free so that they are able to trade freely without barriers, and they are able to work in a way that they want to, they will produce far more than some state-controlled entity ever could. If it's easier to start and grow a company, and more profitable, these companies will attract more investment. They will create more jobs. They will create more opportunities. This will push up wages. When skill gaps arise, workers will train to fill them. Generally speaking, companies will become very successful, the country will become very rich, and this will generally mean that there's a lot more money to go around to help everyone. Whereas the left-wing conception is very much the opposite. They want massive government. They might, for example, want more regulation. They might want to squeeze company profits and to make them fill out huge numbers of paper, or bits of paper, for example. If you look at a big organisation like the EU, they generally want massive amounts of data on, for example, the race breakdown, or I don't know, whatever it is. And this basically makes it more difficult to make money, which in turn means that the economy grows slower and there are less jobs to go around and people are generally poorer. So, some conservatives want to limit immigration. Why will that be? Well, they want a lot of economic growth, but they recognise that a lot of the economic growth is going to be filled with migrants, people from other countries, and they kind of feel that this huge economic growth should actually benefit the people who are already in the country, including people who have already migrated to that country. So they want immigration limited to people who have something to contribute, some good skills, something that the country actually needs. And you might say this is a bit selfish, perhaps, only taking in people whom it benefits the country, but oh well. So with growing opportunities in the economy, the benefits will go to the people already living within the nation, and they view immigration as helping to close skill gaps. where they exist, and it's less about just letting anyone in whom the left want to do because they want to eat their food, for example, and enjoy their culture, and such like that. So right-wingers believe high government taxes and mountains of regulations make it harder for companies to make a profit, which slows growth, stagnates wages, and reduces opportunities. I want to finish up with a few other interesting things. So, conservatives tend to be neater, more orderly. They make great managers, and they are really good at keeping companies growing. They tend to be, like I say, very highly organized and able to maintain businesses. Whereas left-wing people tend to be more entrepreneurial. They're sort of more open to new ideas and new thinking. They're perhaps more open to taking risks and trying something new. Now, generally speaking, more creative people tend to be left-wing because, again, right-wing people tend to be perhaps a bit more homogenized, as in they all want to be part of the group, whereas left-wing people might be more outsiders. If you look at physical appearance, for example, right-wingers tend to be a bit more attractive than left-wingers. And this is mostly because people who are more left-wing might feel outside of society a bit more, and they might also feel a bit hard done by. So they'll kind of want people like themselves to be given a bit of more opportunities, for example. Anyway, guys, I think I'll end it there. I hope you found this video useful. I do apologise about any generalisations, and obviously I've probably made a bunch of mistakes, so let me know what you guys think, and I will speak to you soon.